we're on to Unit 2, and we're going to be looking at, in this unit, metabolism and survival. So this looks at metabolic pathways, the role of membranes in metabolic pathways, the control of metabolic pathways. It looks at cellular respiration and the production of ATP, which is fundamental to metabolism, and it links all of this to the challenge of maintaining metabolism for survival of the whole organism in different environments and different niches. So this first key area here, key area 1, is going to be looking just at metabolic pathways and some of the terminology and some of the concepts around this. First of all, what is cell metabolism? Well, it's the term for the thousands of biochemical reactions that occur within a living cell. I've got the cell missing on this slide here. And many of these steps are ordered into pathways and are controlled at each stage by an enzyme. And what I've done here is I've just looked up a company, it's called Roche, and it has metabolic pathways. You can look that up on Google and have a look at them, but this is just some of the metabolic pathways that are found in living organisms. And you'll see kind of just this one area here. This is just part 1. There's another part, cellular and molecular processes. And you don't worry about this. You don't need to know all of this in detail. You'll be glad to know. But I've actually just highlighted kind of some of the areas that are on that slide previously, what these pathways are, and a couple of them you will recognise. So we've got here the citric cycle, so that's part of your respiration process. Here there's this lipid metabolism, and here there's amino acid metabolism. So you'll see that, or you can just make out very faintly in the background there, that these pathways are kind of pretty complex and there's quite a lot of stages to them. So we're going to have a relook and just cut this down a bit. Where when we're talking about a metabolic pathway, what do we mean? Well, it's a sequence of reactions that's controlled by enzymes that change one metabolite into another. Now, by a metabolite, what we mean is something like, say, glucose is then broken down to pyruvate, and pyruvate is then broken down, for example, to lactic acid when we're looking at anaerobic respiration or we're looking at fermentation. Each of these steps are controlled by an enzyme, and what I've done here is I've just put up a very short metabolic pathway here. So here we've got glucose, and the enzyme A catalyses that reaction where there's a breakdown of glucose to this intermediate substance here, intermediate 1, and then another enzyme is involved in the breakdown of that intermediate 1 to intermediate 2, and we call these metabolites. Now, some metabolic pathways are reversible and some are irreversible. So an example of that is fermentation in, say, muscle cells, where glucose is broken down to lactic acid. Now that is a reversible pathway where we know that the lactic acid can be converted back into pyruvate, and then the rest of the citric acid cycle can take place, if you remember your aerobic respiration from National 5. But where you've got fermentation in yeast cells, the glucose gets broken down to pyruvate, and then the pyruvate will get broken down to carbon dioxide, water and ethanol. And because a carbon is lost from the process, this pathway is an irreversible pathway. Now, some metabolic pathways have got reversible and irreversible steps within them, and that allows the pathway to be kept under some sort of kept under a precise control. And an example I've got here is just the pathway we've looked at before, where the conversion of glucose into intermediate 1 here that is an irreversible step. This can't be reversed. This step here can be, but the beauty of this step here being irreversible is that the glucose is constantly being used up. So it keeps the glucose at a low level, and that means that glucose will constantly be moving or diffusing into the cell in order for it to be in a constant supply there. Now there's two terms that we use for metabolic pathways. This first term up here is the term catabolic, a catabolic pathway. Now a catabolic pathway is where a complex molecule is broken down into a simpler molecule, and that releases energy. In other words, it releases ATP, and it provides building blocks as well for building up larger molecules. The other pathway is anabolic pathway, and an anabolic pathway is where smaller molecules are built up into larger molecules. So these building blocks that are there, so for example here, amino acids being built up into proteins, and that requires energy. So ATP needs to go into this process. ATP is released from this process. Now when we think about these two sort of pathways, the catabolic and the anabolic pathways, we can think of them as being quite closely integrated or dependent on each other. And what we mean by that is that, for example, if we were looking at something like respiration, so over on this side here, we've got respiration, where glucose and oxygen results in the breakdown of glucose and oxygen to carbon dioxide and water. But the key thing is that energy is released in that process, in other words, ATP. And that energy that is released can then be used in synthesizing, say, for example, a protein from an amino acid. So we've got the anabolic pathway that is there. So we can think of these as being dependent on each other. The catabolic pathway is releasing energy in order for anabolic pathways to take place. Now, sometimes a problem occurs in a metabolic pathway where maybe an enzyme isn't synthesized properly. If you think about some of the mutations, some of the gene mutations that you learnt about in Unit 1, where maybe something has gone wrong and the protein hasn't formed properly. And so if the enzyme isn't formed properly, then there can be a problem in a metabolic pathway. So for example, if enzyme B here doesn't work properly, there's been some mutation and it's not working, then what will happen is this intermediate one here will build up in a cell, and that could have quite a serious effect on a cell, because this intermediate one could be fine in low quantities, but in large quantities, as it starts to build up, it could become toxic to a cell. Well, moving on, we're going to have a look at membranes and why they're important for metabolic pathways. And membranes form surfaces and compartments for metabolic pathways. So looking first of all at the plasma membrane. Now, at the plasma membrane, you'll remember from your National 5, it allows the flow of materials in and out of the cell. And its structure is made up of these phospholipids and proteins embedded in it. So you've got this bilayer of phospholipids, if you remember from your National 5, where you've got the heads and the tails of the phospholipids forming this sandwich layer. And embedded in that as well, there are proteins. And this is what is described as the fluid mosaic model. And substances can diffuse in and out of the cell membrane. There's also actually molecules on the surface of the plasma membrane, and so these molecules, some of them they're called signaling molecules, and they're involved in cell communication. So I've mentioned before that substances can diffuse in and out of the membrane, but there's also a job the proteins do on the plasma membrane, and the different roles that they provide. If you've got large molecules, they're dependent on proteins to let them move across the membrane. It may be that there's pores in the proteins and they allow specific molecules or ions to pass through the membrane, and that can be by passive transport, by diffusion. But there are other proteins which act as carrier molecules, and they allow certain ions in and out of the cell, and they are involved in active transport, where you're carrying or you want to get an ion out of the cell. And an example that I've put up on here is called the sodium-potassium pump. And you'll see that outside of the cell here, there's a high concentration of sodium ions and a low concentration of potassium ions. Now, normally what would happen in diffusion, therefore the sodium ions would diffuse into the cell. But in this situation here, what happens is the sodium-potassium pump, this pump or this carrier protein can actually actively take sodium out of the cell. And you'll see here that here's our carrier pump here, our carrier protein, and it's opened up into the cytoplasm, and sodium ions bind to that protein. The binding of the third sodium ion starts or triggers a breakdown of ATP, and that releases energy, and that results in the carrier molecule changing shape, and it releases the sodium ions out of the cell. And what happens is that potassium ions are now able to bind to the carrier, and the carrier's original molecular shape is restored when these ions are bound to the carrier molecule, and the potassium ions are released into the cytoplasm. This requires energy, so it's called active transport, and it results in there being a low concentration of sodium ions and a high concentration of potassium ions inside of the cell. And that is important for the functioning of muscle and nerve cells. A third role of membrane proteins are enzymes. So there are some enzymes that are found on the membrane, and they catalyze specific reactions. So for example, there's an enzyme called ATP synthase. It's found in the inner membrane of the mitochondria, and it catalyzes the production of ATP. So moving on as well, looking at the importance of membranes. Well, membranes actually are important as they allow compartmentalization. So what do I mean by that? Well, it means that you've got situations where you've got small compartments that can form inside organelles, and that compartmentalization helps to increase reaction rates. So the reason why that happens is, I'm looking here at the example of the mitochondria here. So the mitochondria has got, in fact, two membranes. It's got a double membrane. It's got an outer and an inner membrane. So here's the inner membrane here. Here's the outer membrane here. And this inner membrane allows for compartmentalization of reactions to take place. So what happens is that the reactions that are taking place for respiration are taking place inside the mitochondria, which is contained within the cytoplasm. So you're compartmentalizing that reaction inside the mitochondria. Now, you've got a small organelle here, but you've got a large surface area. So you've got a high surface area to volume ratio, and that allows a high concentration of reactants to build up in here. And because you get a high concentration of reactants building up in there, that increases the reaction rate. In other words, you can keep the reactants in this small area, and they're not getting spread about all over the cytoplasm. They're in this small area, so they build up, and the reaction rates, because the higher the concentration you've got of reactants, the faster your reaction rates. And compartmentation enzymes for the citric acid cycle, for example, are kept in compartments called the matrix inside the mitochondria. So this is the matrix area here. Go inside this part here. Now you also notice that the inner membrane all bends and folds, and that obviously is increasing the surface area as well. It acts as a highly metabolic surface area, as the folds all increase the surface area, and that allows reactions to occur faster. I'll post a couple of videos on iTunes U with Mr. Bosman on cell membrane and transport across cell membranes. Now, you will do a little bit of research on this in the classroom. This is looking at venoms, toxins and poisons, and many of these cause a toxic effect by interrupting a metabolic pathway, and when you do your research we'll have a look at some of that.